You know, for as long as most of us have been alive, there's been one clear villain on our dinner plates: saturated fat. The story we were all told was super simple: eat less butter, cheese, and red meat, and you'll save your heart. But what if that story, the one that shaped how we've eaten for over 60 years, is hiding a few massive plot twists?
Okay, so let's dive right into this because the history of saturated fat is honestly a true scientific detective story. It's got everything: a popular theory, a national panic, and bombshell evidence that was literally buried for decades. This isn't just about what's on your plate, it's about how an idea can become an unquestionable truth even when the facts start to get really complicated.
To really get a handle on this, we have to go back, way back, to the beginning, back to the 1950s, to the birth of an idea so powerful it would change how the entire world eats. It's called the diet-heart hypothesis.
And the idea itself was, elegantly simple. Saturated fat leads to high cholesterol leads to clogged arteries, and clogged arteries, well, they lead to heart attacks. It was a neat, straight line. This was the theory championed by a very persuasive physiologist named Ancel Keys, and it was absolutely an idea whose time had come. And just look at how fast it all went down. When President Eisenhower had a heart attack in '55, the whole nation freaked out. Heart disease was the big new killer, and people were desperate for answers. Ancel Keys and his diet-heart hypothesis gave them one. By 1961, the American Heart Association was all in. And by 1977, bam, it was official U.S. government policy. A scientific theory had become public health gospel.
But here is where our detective story takes a major turn. Because even as this official story was being carved into stone, scientists were running these massive, really expensive clinical trials to prove it once and for all. The only problem? The results, well, they weren't cooperating.
We're not talking about small studies here. We're talking huge, government-funded studies, the absolute gold standard of medical research. These were supposed to be the final word, the definitive proof. But when some of the biggest trials came back with results that totally contradicted the diet-heart hypothesis, the data was just largely ignored, or in some cases, never even fully published at all.
This quote right here, this just gets to the absolute heart of the matter. It's from the lead researcher of the largest trial of its kind, the Minnesota Coronary Experiment. So what happens when the results of your multi-million-dollar study don't give you the answer you expected? Well, in this case, the full inconvenient data just sat on a shelf for 16 years.
And the Minnesota study wasn't some isolated case. Look at the Framingham Heart Study, one of the most famous medical investigations in history. Its own data from the 60s showed no link whatsoever between how much saturated fat people ate and their risk of heart disease. The researchers literally wrote in their notes, "No relationship found." But that little finding wasn't publicly mentioned by a director of the study for over 30 years.
Okay, so fast forward a few decades. Researchers actually managed to track down and reanalyze the raw data from that buried Minnesota coronary experiment. And what they found was nothing short of a bombshell. So, first off, the diet worked perfectly, on paper at least. The group that cut out saturated fat and swapped it with things like corn oil saw their cholesterol levels plummet by an average of almost 14%. According to the diet-heart hypothesis, this should have made them way, way healthier.
I mean, that's the logical conclusion, isn't it? Lower your cholesterol, you live longer. That was the entire point of the hypothesis. But when the researchers actually looked at the mortality data, the story completely fell apart. And here's the absolutely terrifying paradox the data showed. Not only did the low saturated fat diet fail to save lives, but for every 30-point drop in a person's cholesterol, the risk of dying actually went up by 22%. Think about that. Lowering cholesterol was associated with a higher risk of death. And the recovered autopsy files were even more stark. When pathologists actually examined the hearts of participants who had died, they found that the group eating the heart-healthy, low-saturated fat diet had evidence of a heart attack nearly twice as often as the group eating the regular, high-saturated fat diet.
So, as you can imagine, rediscovering this kind of evidence has just thrown the whole world of nutrition science into turmoil. The old consensus is completely fractured, leaving us with these two deeply entrenched camps that look at the exact same history and see completely different things.
So on one side, you have the establishment view. Big organizations like Cochrane do these huge meta-analyses, combining dozens of studies. And their 2020 review still concluded that, yeah, cutting saturated fat reduces the risk of cardiovascular events. things like heart attacks and strokes, by 21%. For them, the case is still strong.
And this chart really captures the divide perfectly. The revisionists point to those original buried trials like the Minnesota one and say, look, the foundational evidence is a mess. It never showed that people lived longer. But the establishment points to these broader reviews and says, look at the totality of the data. There's a clear benefit for preventing cardiovascular events. They're both using evidence, but they're focusing on totally different pieces of the puzzle.
So where does this messy, complicated story leave all of us today? Well, the latest science seems to be moving away from this simple good fat versus bad fat narrative and towards something way more nuanced. What's really interesting now is that newer research is suggesting the problem might not have been saturated fat as just one big category, but where it comes from, its source. The idea is that these longer-chain saturated fats, the kind you find in meat, might increase heart attack risk, while the shorter-chain fats, like the ones in dairy, could actually be protective. Now, this could help explain some of those contradictory results from the past. It's not just about how much, but what kind. So why isn't this nuance reflected in official advice? Well, a big part of it is just this powerful institutional inertia. Researchers have pointed out that the U.S. guideline committees have never actually gone back to formally review those pivotal buried trials from the 60s and 70s. And on top of that, investigations have found potential conflicts of interest on these committees, with ties to industries that really benefit from keeping that old low-fat message alive. It's a huge reminder of how hard it can be to change a story that's been told for decades. And that leaves us right here. In the middle of it all, the story of saturated fat is this powerful lesson in how science actually works. It's messy, it's political, and it's constantly changing. The villain we thought we knew for 60 years might just be a much more complex character, leaving us to wonder if the real dietary culprit is still out there, maybe even hiding in plain sight.